So maybe. Can you guys hear us?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. So technically for tonight, we were supposed to start with Genesis 19 through 37 was today's readings. But last week we didn't quite get through everything. And so I want us to go back just a little bit to Genesis 14. And I encourage you guys to read it with a different lens. Do you guys remember this? Did anybody do that?
Yes, you did.
Anybody remember? What? Started to remember or started to do it? Oh, started. What I encouraged was for you to read the chapter 14 of Genesis through the lens as if it was a Western.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
We got it.
And so if I was to give my own retelling of this, we have the 5 cowboys versus the 4 cowboys and their posses. And they come together in this great shootout, and the one side wins and they carry off all the people of the town. Does this sound like it could be a Western?
Yes.
And they just so happen that as they carry off the people of the town, they didn't realize that they took old Abe's nephew. And so Abe, he rounds up his men and they go for a ride. And they run off and they capture them and they take them down and they get all the stuff and they come back and everybody's triumph. Can you hear the Western in that?
Yeah.
A little bit like, well, Yellowstone is a modern Western, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I say that to say this is one particular story that lends itself to a particular genre of stories, right? And if we start to allow the stories of Scripture to be that, they're stories, they're stories that were told around the campfire until people knew how to write it down and then how to read it. It was told mostly orally. And the tradition, now for us, that seems so odd because we don't memorize stories to this extent. Except we do, don't we? When it's our story. I mean, we just went through the holidays, right? And if you had your family around, I'm certain that there were stories that got told. And a lot of times the same stories get told every year, right?
Yep.
I remember when my dad's mom started to get dementia, she would tell the story. The first year that she had dementia, she'd tell us the same story 3 or 4 times, and she got all the details right. But we knew her dementia was getting bad when she started to slip the details. And of course, then everybody else, I could hear my Aunt Sherry, Mom, you got it wrong. It was la 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 la, right? You know what I'm saying? We do have a moderately oral tradition, but we're mostly a text-based tradition, aren't we? And so these stories were told as stories. They weren't just these verses that are written down as we read them. So when you read them, it's especially when you get to this last half of Genesis, it's good to look at it from the guise of how would this have been told, not how is it written. Because, prime example, I'm certain since most of you know the poem, This is the House That Jack Built. You guys remember that? No?
Yeah.
Nobody does. Did anybody on there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
A couple of you do. Okay.
Yes.
Well, I read this story when I was like in 2nd or 3rd grade. And then my dad told the story and he made the caricatures when he's talking about the rat and he's doing this and the house, and he does this acting out as he tells the story. It wasn't just we're standing before a judge and we need to be straight-laced and we need to give the facts. These were stories. Do you get what I'm saying? And so oftentimes people look at the book of Genesis and they say, well, it's
Yeah.
not a history book. It's not factual.
Slobber.
I would argue it's very history
I'm changing
oriented
shirts.
and it's very factual. It's just not the same way that we view facts and history today. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so as you read through these stories, you're going to encounter things that for us seem culturally just weird. But yet it's not our culture. And we got to remember that. It's not our time. Most of this is this section in particular is at least probably 3,500 years old. This is not yesterday's news. But this is a story that keeps being told over and over and over again.
It is.
Does that help to kind of set the stage a little bit?
Yes.
I hope that as you're reading this, and especially as we move through the Old Testament, you'll let your imagination come into the reading of these stories. Is that fair enough?
Sure.
Any questions on that?
No.
I mean, especially, we could talk about chapter 16, the Sarah and Hagar thing. I mean, that's just weird. Prime example of guys saying, yes, dear, I'll do whatever you want. And then, dear, it was your idea. Why are you mad at me?
Yeah.
You know, somebody's heard that before, apparently.
Yeah.
As we move into this week's, any questions about the last week's readings through chapter 19 or through chapter 18? What we were supposed to cover last week. I want to make sure I get any questions. If not, then we're going to move on to this week. So we started Thursday with Genesis 19 through 20. And this is a very interesting story because we're kind of getting on the stuff in the box, aren't we? The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is such, it's become almost a culture defining story, hasn't it?
Yes.
The
Yes.
reality of what's going on here has shaped our language to the point to where a sodomite becomes somebody that we now know as somebody who's got same-sex attraction. And yet there's some interesting stuff about that, but it causes us to miss part of the point of this story. Why is Sodom so evil?
I
You
don't
guys catch
know.
it? Well, they quit obeying God, yes. Notice last week, let's go back to chapter 18, and I'm going to read verses 22 through the end of the chapter. You remember this section? Yeah. So the men turned from there and went towards Sodom, but Abraham stood still before the Lord. Then Abraham drew near and said, will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? And the Lord said, if I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake. Abraham answered and said, behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord. I who am but dust and ashes. Suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for the lack of 5? And he says, I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. And again, he spoke to him and said, suppose 40 are found there. He answered, for the sake of 40, I will not do it. Then he said, oh, let the Lord not be angry, and I will speak. And I will speak. Suppose 30 are found there. And he answered, I will not do it if I find 30 there. And he said, behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are found there. He answered, for the sake of 20, I will not destroy it. Then he said, oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak again, but this once. Suppose 10 are found there. He answered, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. And the Lord went his way when he had finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. The thing that God is looking for is righteousness. And notice the qualification. We only need 10. One of the things that we see is as we move right into the story, the two angels came to Sodom. Immediately, what happens? Lot's not necessarily a good guy in this story. Have you noticed that?
Yeah. Not,
He says, come stay with me because they're not going to treat you well. He's not bringing these two angels into his house because it's the right thing to do. He just doesn't want it to look bad. And this chapter in particular, a lot of ink has been spilled on the fact that Sodom was a place where there was no hospitality. It wasn't just the sexual acts. In fact, to be honest, the sexual acts were an outflow of the fact that they were an unwelcoming community. Anybody who is outside, I mean, look at how Lot reacts. When they come to take these two angels, he says, here, I'll give you my virgin daughters. Go sleep with them instead. Is Lot really righteous?
no,
No.
not at all.
So I just want to point out the reality. Yes, there is what our culture has done with this story, but when we make that the thing, it's too easy for us to, well, we're not that way, so therefore it's not really about us. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And we fail to see that this reality of being a people who welcome the other, who are kind to the stranger, because isn't that the way God works? Yes. Okay, go for it. You got to have coffee. Am I making sense though?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Reference from Ezekiel that they bring up says that they had a lot of pride, destitute, yet they ignore those people who do things, not just from the outside, but within the city itself.
Yes. So we always have to be cautious about a story that feels very familiar about us going directly to that point that we know without actually reading the story and letting it speak to us. Yes, sir.
When it comes to hospitality, we have our own ideas of hospitality as Westerners, but we don't stop to keep in mind that Easterners may have a whole different view.
Mhm.
If someone was to come unannounced to be a visitor, you were expected to have a full pantry and available livestock to kill, feed them, places for them to sleep, and the best of everything would be served to them. 50 years ago, I had a professor at Alabama who his name was Robert Lunsford, Dr. Robert Lunsford. And he had done a sabbatical over in the Middle East. And in his time there, he went to visit this one gentleman, and it was rather late in the evening, about 10 o'clock at night, which was somewhat unusual. But schedules being what they were, that's what it came down to. When he arrived, the gentleman, saw him and invited him in, asked him to remove his shoes. And they gave him some comfortable slippers to put on. They gave him, the highest, most prestigious seat to be in. And the gentleman asked,
Oh, yeah.
his children to go get certain things. They came back, they had wine, beer, hard liquor, cigarettes and cigars. And they offered any of these to Dr. Lunsford, who was a Nazarene.
Teetotaler.
Yeah. And he said, well, thank you very much, but I don't smoke or drink. And the man was just appalled. He thought all Westerners had those things. And so he kept them in stock, not because he, as a Muslim, would have anything to do with them, but because he wanted to be hospitable in a way that the foreigner would appreciate it. So he said, what would you like? He said, well, I would enjoy a Coke if you don't mind. So the man dragged his 10-year-old child out of bed and gave him some money and said, go to such and such a place here in the city and get some Coke and bring it back. So he sent this little boy out after 10 at night into the city of life to go get some Coke because hospitality demanded that he have what that man wanted.
Terrific. Why did he
When
ask?
I entered ministry 20 years ago, it was commonplace and all but expected that the pastor would drop by and visit people. I learned very quickly the first time that I dropped by one of my elderly ladies who was not expecting me to come, and I proceeded to get griped out for her not being ready for me to be there. And it created this conundrum in me because here I was taught there was this expectation. Pastors go visit people in their homes, but our culture has shifted. And now I've basically been told, Pastor, if we want you to come, we'll let you know. Occasionally you get somebody who says, just drop by anytime. I did that once on a person who said, drop by anytime. And we were out and about and we dropped by and it was the wrong time. And from that point forward, hospitality has changed. The cultural requirements have changed. But this notion of how we treat the other, the outsider, the visitor, that really hasn't changed, has it? And I think in some ways, because we have linked the sin of Sodom so much to the sexual act, we fail to see how we especially here in modern America, are extremely unhospitable. It's very difficult for a new person to move into town and for them to get integrated. It's very hard for someone who hasn't grown up in Western culture to understand even how things work here. And it takes forever to get integrated. And so I bring that up to show that this is it's a horrible story, really, but it's too easy for us to miss a big chunk of the point because of what we see as the exclamation point. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Mhm. Yes.
Any other thoughts on the story of Sodom and Gomorrah?
One more point about hospitality.
Go for it.
They believe that as long as you have a visitor in your house, that person falls under your protection. So if someone hostile came to your door wanting to kill your visitor, you would not allow that to the point of giving up your life to protect them.
They, in essence, when you invite someone into your home, they become family. At least while they're living with you. Yeah.
Well, in some cases, higher than family.
And in some cases, yes, higher than family.
Remember that we're admonished that, in, taking care of strangers, for in such some have visitors.
Paul points back to this story, particularly chapter 18, to say that when you are hospitable to the other, you may actually be entertaining God's servants in the wake. So yes. Any other thoughts? Anybody else just deeply appalled by the last of this chapter with Lot and his daughters?
Yes.
Yes, very much.
Now, it's interesting, as I said, these are stories that are meant to be told together, right? So as we move into chapter 20, we can't divorce it from chapter 19. Okay? This isn't, just a reminder, the chapter and verse markings that we have today in our Bibles are only about 500 years old. They're a relatively new thing, and they were designed to help scribes make sure they transcribed it correctly. You could only memorize so many characters in a row before you had to go back and memorize a whole new line to write it. By the same token, they helped, once we had the printing press, they absolutely helped printers to make sure that they could print it correctly. So sometimes the chapter and verse markings are going to be helpful, and sometimes they absolutely are not helpful, which poses a real problem on Sunday morning whenever I'm wanting to do a scripture reading, and I have this inner need to make sure that we deal with the whole section, and I hate to just put up a half of a verse, but it happens, right? So in chapter 20, we get Abraham again, right? He's just had this encounter with God, and now he's meeting with Abimelech. And if you remember, has Abraham learned his lesson?
No.
No, not at all.
No. What he did to Pharaoh, he now does to Abimelech. And if you remember at the end of chapter 18, what is Abraham arguing with God about? If
Don't
there are
destroy
10
them.
righteous, would you spare this city?
Yeah,
And is Abraham being righteous?
No.
calling God out. Not
You get
really.
the irony of this?
Protecting himself.
Yes, there are always those people who do the wrong thing and come out smelling like roses. I realize there are always those people. I've never been that person, and I'm not real happy about Grandpa Abe here. I'm sure all the ladies are not either. Yes, sir.
One of the things about Abram going to him with these diminishing numbers of righteous and asking if he'd save the town. In formal study of logic, that's referred to as the argument of the beard. If you have a full-face beard and you pluck out 10 hairs, is it still a beard? So
Is this a beard?
so then you say, well, okay, if you pluck out another 100, is it still a beard? And you finally get down to where you're arguing over whether one hair is still a beard. If you keep following that particular train of thought. But it's what's called an informal fallacy of logic, because it doesn't differentiate between the extremes.
Here, on the one hand, you know, he's trying to argue for the righteousness to save this city. And then, like I said, though, he hasn't learned his lesson. He'll argue it for others, but And remember, this is Abraham, the one in whom faith is, his faith accounts him as righteous. Do you see the conundrum that paints for us? How should that make us feel? If Abraham is accounted as righteous because of his faith in God, and he does all of these stupid things, should that not grant us a little more reprieve than what we maybe give ourselves? Just saying.
Judy.
He really had not accepted that God knew what he was doing and would take all those things into account.
What? He didn't trust God? Surely no human being has ever not trusted God.
I think it's a matter that he was innocent by virtue of just not knowing God well enough yet.
He should have known God.
Yeah.
Ooh, we're getting into some interesting semantics there. Yes, sir.
I think we need to refer back to what we talked about. The difference between being righteous with God and being sinless.
Absolutely. There is absolutely a difference between being righteous before God because of our faith in God and being sinless. We want to equate those two things with each other. And righteousness and sinless are not the same thing. They should look pretty similar. In theory, one who is righteous should be sinless, right?
Mhm.
And one who is sinless should be righteous. But that's not always the case. And I love Genesis for this fact. We have this family that realistically, if they were here today, and of course he just passed away not that long ago, but they belong on the Jerry Springer show, don't they?
Yes,
Mhm.
yeah.
Maury Povich, whatever the current ridiculous TV show is, you know, this family could fit there. And yet that's the family that God chooses to work through. And if God can work through them, how much more can he work through us? Especially if we're not that. How do you guys handle Genesis chapter 22? It's one of the few stories that we equate to being worth told to kids. I've never understood it. There's a handful of the stories that we tell kids, and I'm like, that just doesn't make sense. Okay, we're going to tell a story about how a dad's going to sacrifice his son.
Yeah.
What do we do with this?
I couldn't do it. I couldn't have, I don't
Any
think
thoughts?
strong enough to do that.
Just read it and not
That Pat's voice.
background, you would think that
She's there.
Abraham was taking
She sounds like she's
a
sick.
young son to sacrifice. But when you do the Bible study, it says that he's probably around 24 years old.
So this is one of the areas where the English language hides a fact. What is clear is Isaac is an unmarried man. The title of a young man just means unmarried. You can be a young man and be in your 40s or 50s, technically, the way the term is used. It's the same thing as like the term virgin. A virgin technically meant an unwed woman. Later it becomes an unwed, undefiled woman. But originally it just meant someone who was of age and could be married but wasn't. But most scholars and most Jewish people would absolutely affirm Isaac is at least old enough to be a man. Whatever that means. If it's 14, like modern Jewish culture, whether it's 18 like our culture, whether he's 24, 25, he is, for all intents and purposes, a full-fledged adult who can make his own decisions.
So
How
why-
does that change the story?
Why didn't he fight his dad? Why didn't he stop?
Does it change the story?
Why are you doing this?
Yes.
Can't hear it.
It absolutely paints Isaac in a far different light, doesn't it?
Mhm.
When he asks Abraham, where is the sacrifice? And Abraham responds with, God will provide it. And then he proceeds to let his father bind him.
Tie him up.
Now think about this for just a little bit. Abraham is, if Isaac is 24, just saying, let's use that number, that makes Abraham 123. Remember, Abraham was 99 when Isaac was born.
Mhm.
How much different does it look when you have a 123-year-old binding a 23-year-old, a 24-year-old? I almost get the picture of Abraham wrapping it around him and Isaac has to throw himself up on top of the altar. I say that somewhat in jest, but you get the picture of what's going on here.
Yes.
Isaac is a full participant in this. Now,
Why he said,
there's a question about what do they actually believe in the Old Testament. We talked about this a couple weeks ago about Sheol, right? But they seem to believe, remember, that they're coming down the mountain from this experience. So even if Abraham goes all the way through with it and sacrifices his son, they believe that God will bring him back to life or something.
Okay.
Of course, this really is odd for us because we know by the time we get to Exodus, the very next book, God will say the sacrifice of children is an abomination to me. And if God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, what do we do with that in this story?
it didn't happen.
And I'm going to start by saying right now, there's no wrong answers. So just, what are you thinking? What do you do with this?
We watch a lot of game shows, and if you're not listening to the question, you can give a right answer, but it's the wrong answer.
Yep.
Because it wasn't what was asked. If they listened, and I believe they did, because again, oral tradition, they passed this on for years and years and years. God told Abraham through his bloodline, through Isaac, that he would make mighty nations. And you know, the stars in the sky, and kind of sand in the sea and everything. If they truly believe that, then the important thing was to show God that they believed that and do exactly what he said, which is exactly what they did. And, you know, it was no, I'm convinced it was not a surprise to Isaac that there
What's the
was,
scripture?
through him, there was going to be many nations.
Oh, we can't think at all that Isaac wasn't told every day of his life that he was the child of promise. Can you, I mean, those of you who have had kids, and especially the ladies' moms, you can't tell me that you wouldn't ever play the card. Well, I just couldn't have any kids and I was 90 years old when I had you. So you really need to treat me better than that. You're the special one. You better do what I say. You can't hear that card be played at all, can you? In fact, there's probably to a point in modern language where Isaac might be thinking, you know what, maybe I just need to be sacrificed and we can be done with this. That's taking a little far, but
No, I don't think so.
the other side of it is, do you think Sarah knew what was going on?
Mm-mm.
How could
If
she
you're
not?
taking the donkey. So one of the things you need to know about donkey is a donkey became a symbol for death. The donkey was the animal that was allowed to carry a dead body outside of the camp, outside of,
She had to
and so when Jesus rides in on a donkey, it's also a symbol that he will be riding out on the donkey. He will give his life. So they're taking the donkey. They're taking the knife, the ceremonial knife that they would have used only for sacrifices. They're taking the kindling. They're taking the fire. They're taking all the elements of a sacrifice without an offering. Do you think even at 123, Sarah would believe that Abraham would forget the offering? At least one person says no.
No,
I don't either.
So either they had to steal away in the early morning before Mama got up, or Mama was going to ask a lot of questions, right?
Yeah.
Or bare minimum, Abraham is going to make his wife very upset because he's not answering questions that she's going to ask. You get what I'm saying?
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Which is why I had to struggle with this the last time we read through this and we really studied it. Because did you notice at the end of chapter 22, do they come down together?
I think so.
22. Abraham comes down without Isaac.
What version do you read?
Verse 19. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba.
I'm reading, so Abraham and Isaac returned to the waiting place.
Ooh, so yours has added that in.
Then they returned.
Get the message and see what.
And then NLT makes this designation. See
Oh, there it is.
Only Abraham.
that the Hebrew implies that only Abraham came down. So so this translation, the New Living, are making a shift to imply that Isaac came with him. But the actual Hebrew says that they didn't. That Isaac stayed up there. And according to tradition, Isaac actually goes and spends time with Melchizedek and becomes a priest, according to the Jewish rabbis. But the other interesting thing is, where does Abraham go? He goes to Beersheba. Where did he leave Sarah? Did she know that he was going to go to Beersheba after the fact?
Didn't matter.
It doesn't say. When Sarah dies, where is Abraham? Not by her side. If Sarah knew what was going to happen, do you think she was very happy about it?
Yeah.
Especially whenever Abraham doesn't let her come and talk him out of it. If she doesn't know what's happening, then it seems pretty clear to me that Abraham is afraid to go back and tell her what happened. Oh yeah, me and the boys, we went out and we were doing this project, and I had to take my son to the hospital because he about lost his life. I'm sure at that point, Melissa would be about ready to skin me alive.
Yep.
I point this out to say this reality. I don't know that this reading of the story is 100% correct. In the Hebrew, it seems to imply Sarah knew what was going on. They left. Abraham and Isaac go up on the mountain. It seems that only Abraham comes down and he goes somewhere else.
Well, maybe.
For all intents and purposes, if this was happening today, it almost implies, I can almost hear Sarah say, Abraham, if you're going to go do this, you're going to take our son's life, you just better not come back. Mama, has anybody ever said that kind of thing? You may not have meant it to that harshly. When we do encounter Isaac again, he is staying in his mom's tent, not with his dad.
Yeah. He was upset with his dad too.
I say all this to say, if you read it at a very surface level, what we have to, a conclusion that can be made is that sometimes following God requires us to do things that our family will not accept.
True.
Is that fair enough?
Yes.
What?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Very wood that he's going to be sacrificed for, and then wood is placed upon him, just like Christ.
So yes, when they go up the mountain, the wood is placed on Isaac and he carries the tree.
Isn't this whole thing kind of foretelling of Christ?
Well,
With, you know, the father sacrificing the son?
what it shows is exactly that. Because you have not withheld your son, your only son from me, I will now, that confirms my covenant with you. And then God turns around and in the Gospels does the very thing that Abraham is willing to do, but God doesn't require him to finish. And so on this side of the cross, we absolutely see the foretelling or the fourth telling of it. Because remember, Abraham is given the promise that Isaac, through Isaac, the promise that's given to Adam, that from his seed, from his line, from a child of Eve, will come one who will destroy the enemy. And so there's a lot of nuances to the story, which causes me to again ask the question, why in the world would we think that this is an appropriate children's story? Even if you try and kind of water it down to something that is moderately kid-friendly, this is a potent story, right? There's a lot of oddities to it. Yeah, so in chapter 23, we get Sarah's death. And like I said, it seems to imply, I mean, I guess we could hope that they reconciled. Maybe just Abraham was out in the fields with the flocks and he just happened to be away when Sarah got ill. But it could also be read in a way where it seems like post this almost sacrifice of Isaac, their relationship isn't the same. Of course, by the same token, if he gave her away to Pharaoh and then he gave her away to Abimelech and then he tried to sacrifice her son, at what point is she going to say enough is enough?
Should have said it a long time ago.
What do you do as we move into the next chapter, 24? What do you do with the story of how Rebecca is chosen for Isaac? Anybody got any thoughts?
Romantic.
Somewhat, yeah, could be.
Abraham's servant.
Anybody
Was-
notice the cultural piece in this story?
Or the, you have to marry the old one first.
Well, that comes here in a little later.
Yellow.
When she agrees to marry Isaac, what does the servant do for her?
Gives her a lot of gifts.
He gives her gold bracelets and a ring for her
Nose.
nose. There's a part of me that's wanted to walk around today and say, okay, I wonder how many of you girls are engaged to be married. In many cultures of the world, a pierced nose is the symbol of being engaged or married, because they don't do it this way. Just thought I'd like to point that out.
Thank goodness.
Of course, then what do you do with the fact that the ones that have multiple piercings? So is it the reverse polygamy where they've got more than one husband? I don't, sorry.
Possibly.
Way to control a bull or.
Well, this, yes, is tech,
You pierce them, then you got something to drag them around by.
anyway, let's move on from that one. I don't know if you guys can hear online, but you can ask John about how he's got foot and mouth disease tonight.
That's good. I didn't get it.
John.
So we all think that.
Well, okay. We all might be guilty of something else, but John just said it. What do you make of how after Sarah has passed and Abraham gets remarried and he has all these other kids, how he treats the other kids?
They don't get any inheritance.
They get a trinket, a token, they get something, but realistically, they get next to nothing.
Nothing. Everything.
In our culture today, that just doesn't fly, does it?
No.
One of the things that we have to understand about this culture is they were a clan-based culture. For us today, the primary economic unit is the individual, right? Each person has the authority, once you're a legal and adult, right? You can go out and you can get loans, you can make contracts, you can buy, you can sell, you can give yourself out and be hired for work, right? The individual is the economic unit. It wasn't that long ago that it was the family that was the economic unit, right? Where the husband was the one who worked and the wife and the kids stayed home. Correct? That wasn't that long ago. We don't have to go back much further than that, where it was the extended family that was the economic unit. My dad talks about the fact that his grandma lived with him until the day she died. She was a part of the family. It was very common, and it still is in some places, where you have the family where they build multiple homes on a plot of land and they're kind of together in what we almost call a compound today, right? At this point in time in human history, and for much of the world today, the basic economic unit was not the individual. It was not what we call the nuclear family. It was not the extended family. It was the clan. And the firstborn son was the head of the clan. And the head of the clan had the responsibility of caring for everyone in the clan. Which is why what often would happen is when dad passed away, 90% of his assets went to the firstborn son and 10% went to everybody else. Because that firstborn son now has the responsibility of caring for everybody else. Now, is Isaac the firstborn son?
No.
Technically, in our way of thinking, no, because Ishmael was born first, right?
Yes.
But what God says is that while Ishmael will be blessed and he does become the father of 12 nations, from God's perspective, the child of the promise, child who is to be the firstborn, is Isaac. Now, this is another cultural piece, and it makes absolutely no sense to us today because we don't really like polygamy. We don't allow for it in our culture. Outside of like Utah and some very interesting places, few places, polygamy is not common in our culture, right? The other piece you need to understand is it's not the firstborn son per se, it's the firstborn son of the favored wife. The firstborn son of the favored wife. Now, in next week's where we start talking about the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 sons of Israel, you're going to see this playing out. Because Joseph is the firstborn son of Rachel,
Yeah.
whereas Reuben is the firstborn son. Culturally, it should be Reuben that is the favored and should be the head of the clan, but Rachel is the favored wife. In this instance, from our Western perspective, Ishmael should be the favored son and should lead the clan, but Sarah is the favored wife, and therefore it is Isaac who will lead the clan. And so when we come to the end of Abraham's life, the fact that he gives anything to the rest of his kids actually is a great gift because it diminishes the resources of the clan. It diminishes Isaac's ability to care for everyone else.
It kind of gives the rest of the clan the ability to go off on their own.
It very well could be. It was very common that they would take that small little nugget that they got, and because they were not in charge of the clan, this was a time to break off and go form their own clan. And many of them did. But understand the fact that Abraham gave them anything actually is a great sacrifice. You get what I'm saying? This is not our culture. This is not how we do it. But that's why I want to explain the tribal culture to us, because it helps to explain some of these things that for us just feel odd, because it's not the way we do it today. So, because today in our society, if someone dies and they don't have a will that explicitly explains how it's divided up, it's divided equally amongst all heirs, right?
Yes.
Doesn't matter if you're a blood child, an adopted child, if you're a part of that family, you're an equal heir, correct?
Unless they have a living spouse.
Unless they have a living spouse,
And it all goes to.
and then it goes to the spouse, unless there is a will. And so, and even sometimes the will supersede spousal privilege or child privilege, and sometimes it won't. Our culture is just different from this.
That's right.
And so when we see one person being treated so lavishly, we need to understand, while yes, it is a level of playing favorites, anybody want to be in the clan where the firstborn son is the irresponsible one and just squanders everything?
No,
Anybody really want that person to be in charge of you?
no,
So often what would happen is they would pick the most responsible son. Now, technically, it should be the firstborn, but it wasn't always. Are you getting what I'm saying here?
Yes.
So that's why giving the blessing
Is-
becomes very significant because that's the point it's actually named.
The blessing and the inheritance are two very different things. And of course, in this week's reading, we get into this, right? So we have Jacob and Esau. Esau gives away his birthright. This means that even though Esau is the firstborn son, he is giving away the head of the clanship birthright. But then on top of it, Jacob steals the blessing. And those are two very different things. The blessing here at the end of Abraham's life, notice he blesses all of his children. That's his prerogative to give something to each of them. We look at it as it almost feels like they're dismissed, right? Compared to what Isaac gets. But there's that blessing. Anybody get confused in
Yeah.
chapter, when we were dealing with chapter 30. Or actually, it comes at the end of chapter 29. Jacob's children. Anybody feel like this is a soap opera? To a point, ladies, you can cover your ears if you want, but sometimes I feel sorry for Jacob that he just seems like he's being yanked around. By the same token, he kind of let it happen to him. Bare minimum, we should at least not like Laban, right?
Yes.
For pulling the switcheroo. But can you see now with that understanding of the clan, why it's so important that these two women feel like they have to have a son? And it's not just that they need one son. With each successive son, it gives them a greater chance of being in the favored status. And the mother of the clan chief is going to have a higher position and be better cared for. Now, that doesn't make the jealousy right, but I want us to help us to understand what's going on in the story. Does that make sense?
Yes.
There's also this reality of what do you do with Zilpah and Bilhah? This is not the way we interact today, is it?
No. Well, we don't have slaves.
Right. Did you say something, Robert?
Yes, I said we don't have slaves now.
Servants.
Why is it not?
It's been through my phone.
You muted it.
Say that. Oh, hey, there it goes. You guys have been talking. If you guys have been talking, I'm sorry, I didn't hear it.
I said we don't have slaves.
No, we don't at all. That's just not our way of living. So this feels completely foreign right there.
Yep.
Go ahead. Was somebody else adding in?
The same way it could be our employees, so, we have servants.
So-
A lot of times people do, but.
So we're going to deal with two different things here. Part of, thank you for the laugh, Georgia. I appreciate that. She said her husband is her servant.
Yeah.
Poor Chris.
How we know about the rings to the nose.
The rings to the nose. So part of what I want to talk about here is we need to talk again about this clan understanding, right? Because the clan chief was who was in charge of making sure that everyone was cared for. A person who becomes a slave realistically, the most equal thing to this in our culture today is not our modern understanding of slavery. It's essentially an employee. A slave for this point is someone who cannot run their own household enough to provide for themselves. They need someone else to employ them so that they can care for themselves. Now, the way I said that is not how I meant it to sound, but the reality is if you work for someone else, culturally speaking, you are their servant, you are their slave. We are working for them and they pay us for our time, right? They provide for us what we need to live. It's so your employer, the owner of the business, in essence, is almost like the leader of the clan. So when we read this slavery language, it's far for us to get the point, the moral of the story, so to speak. We want to think more that terminology. Now, ideally, they had this notion where every clan was able to stand for themselves. Every household was able to pull their own weight and be able to do their own thing, which is why once we get into Exodus, you'll see that God says that a person is not allowed to be a slave any more than 6 years. In the 7th year, they have to be let go. Supposedly, that's more like what we might call a 6-year internship, a 6-year apprenticeship. And in the 7th year, they should know everything needed for them to go off and now do it on their own. Yes. Yes, man, household?
No,
Oh,
I
okay.
didn't say anything.
It just, the green box came up around you, so I thought maybe you had said something. Yes, Bob.
The, I know we're not into Greek here, but I feel pretty sure that in the Septuagint, they would have been using the word doulos,
Servant.
but also slave.
Servant, slave are the exact same word.
Right.
So we would tend to want to use servant because it's more palatable to our sensibilities. But whether you say slave, servant, employee, essentially it all means the same thing.
Now, oftentimes the servants, if they had finished their period of time and they enjoyed themselves as though they were a part of the family and were appreciated.
I know where you're going.
respected,
Keep going.
they could have a mark put on their body showing that they were a quote love slave, not a sexual sense, but in the sense that they loved the clan, they loved the family.
For
And
all intents and purposes, they were adopted into the family.
that they would be a part of that.
Anybody know what the symbol of saying that you have willingly submitted yourself to being a part of a different family other than your own is?
Holding it,
That's right.
Wow.
So culturally speaking, now here's the interesting thing about that. More often in our culture, up until recently, who tended to get their ears pierced? Women. Isn't most women who are married, don't they do that very thing? In our culture today, when you get married, you more often than not, you take your husband's
Yeah.
name, become a part of that family. That symbolism is there. And in fact, for much of human history, women weren't allowed to get their ears pierced until they were married. Because it was a symbol that they were a part of a different clan. And that stems back to the cultural practices. So let's bring us back to Zilpah and Bilhah. Anybody feel sorry for them? You don't feel sorry for them? They're being, it feels a little bit like they're being pawned off, right?
Mhm.
Now, the good side of this is by them having children by the leader of the clan, that puts them in a higher standing than what they might have had before. And that still feels odd to us, right? This is just not our culture. But how many of you know someone who couldn't have kids and they had someone be a surrogate for them? It's not as common as it used to be because today we have now in vitro fertilization and we do a lot of other things to help people have kids who under regular circumstances can't. But the notion of surrogacy was a fairly common practice for a long time. And that's in essence what's happening here. When Rachel and Leah can't have their own kids, they bring in Bilhah and Zilpah to be surrogates on their behalf. So for all intents and purposes, while they are their children, they are also children of their mistress.
It's interesting that in 36, Rachel said that God has vindicated her and he has listened to her plea, giving her a son.
Yes.
He didn't really. He didn't give her a son.
But that's the thing. The culture is different.
Property.
So one of the things we have to understand in our world today, how do we determine whether or not someone is the child of someone else?
DNA.
DNA testing, right? We very quickly will go to a DNA test. Before there were DNA tests, how did you know if someone was a child of someone else? We looked at the characteristics. Do they look like their parents, right? Do they look like they fit with the family? In the scriptural world, the way that they knew whether or not a child belonged to someone else is, did the father claim them? By the simple fact of the head of the clan claiming a child, by the simple fact of the head of the clan naming the child, it is a declaration that that child is yours. And it didn't matter if they looked the same, what you were throwing out then. You might have the whitest white family and all of a sudden they have the deepest black child, but if the dad claimed them, no one said a thing.
Publicly.
So bringing it back to what we just went through, the season of Christmas, right? What does the angel tell Joseph to do? Take Mary as your wife, take the child and name the child.
Yeah.
Mhm.
By Joseph naming Jesus, he is claiming him as his son.
But it doesn't say that Jacob named him. It says that Rachel did.
So here again, this paints an interesting picture. Whose job is it to name the son? Jacob's. Who's doing the naming? What has-
It's the adopted mother.
It's either the adopted mother, it's the adopted mother, right? Is Jacob doing his job? Jacob is not acting like the strong leader here. He is not acting as the leader of his clan. He is allowing his wives to run his life. It's very obvious, right?
Mhm.
Now think about this for a little bit. Remember, this is Jacob. Jacob, the literal word means grabber, one who grasps at things. He's given this name because when they were born, right, he was grabbing at the heel of his brother. He grasps and he takes Esau's birthright. He deceives and he takes the blessing. He goes and he deceives his father-in-law, right, for all of the sheep and the goats and the herds. But when he's finally on his own and he's in control, does he know what to do? No.
No, he doesn't.
again, is this family anywhere near what you would expect for the family that God would choose to work through?
Not so much.
Exactly. Not so much. And we should, as we read this, we should take great comfort from that. One of the things that Genesis does over and over for me is there are so many people who I hear, I can't be a Christian because I just don't have my life together.
Well, neither did these people.
Exactly. Have you read scripture? Did any of them have their act together?
Jesus.
Jesus is it. He's
Yep.
the only one. And he has his act together and he lays it down for everybody else.
And they still.
And they still don't do it.
Mhm.
Abraham's the chosen one and he still doesn't do it right. Isaac is the next chosen one and he doesn't do it right. Jacob, chosen one. Are we seeing a pattern here? They were all very human. Now, remember what I said a couple weeks ago in my sermon, though. Being very human also should mean we're fully made in the image of God. Really, that phrase of being human should elevate us to something beyond the animals. But we see them acting very animalistic here, don't we?
I see something.
Go for it.
As you were saying at the beginning about the storytelling. Genesis was,
Thank you.
was a story that was told over and over, up until the time that Moses, was able to put it into writing.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're looking back over centuries before.
Bare minimum, probably around 400 to 500 years between when the events happen and when they finally get written down. If you take it literally for what it says.
Maybe even more than that.
Could be more, yes.
Because we had 400 years in Egypt.
Mhm.
So, the thing that I see here is that we're getting these stories fleshing out what was done in a given situation. And we have a number of different situations. Down the way, they refer back to these because they can see what the situation was, how it developed, and what happened as a result, so that people could get a moral out of the story. I think we see them going to having just one wife in large part because we're seeing the conflict between the wives.
Excuse me.
It's hard enough to keep, like I've said, I don't understand polygamists. It's hard enough to keep one wife happy. I wouldn't try and want to do it with two, let alone some of these stupid people who've got four.
Or more.
Or more. Well, I want to make sure that we get through the end of our time. I don't want to keep being behind. So I want to talk a little bit about here 32. The story of Jacob wrestling with God.
That was amazing.
A very interesting story, right?
Yes.
I want to read it from my translation and let's have a quick discussion around it.
Number
Chapter
32.
32, verse 22 and 30.
22.
The same night he arose and took his 2 wives and his 2 female servants and his 11 children and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. And Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day has broken." But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask me my name? And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh. So first of all, we want to set the context of this. He's getting ready to encounter his brother, right? What's he do? He sends all his wives, all his children, and all his goods across the river. What would that make you think he's getting ready to do?
Yeah, no.
Has Jacob ever shown himself to be the strong, courageous type?
No,
No.
not at all.
He's the deceiver, right? He gets what he wants by deception, by underhanded means, he doesn't take things on face to face. The way this is written, it seems to imply that if Esau doesn't receive his wives very well, he's on the other side of the river. He can get out of there before his life is taken too. And as he's thinking of escaping, it says in verse 24, and Jacob was alone, and a man wrestled with him. Who wrestled who?
A man wrestled with him.
The man, God, wrestled with Jacob. I haven't been to a whole lot of wrestling matches, but any of you been to wrestling matches?
No,
All intents and purposes, I was told by a wrestler, the way this is described is Jacob is getting ready to run in the middle of the night. He's hightailing it, and God pins him to the ground and holds him there until the break of dawn. He's not going to slink away in the middle of the night. And then once dawn breaks, then Jacob's like, fine, if you're not going to let me run, he grabs onto the man and says, you're not leaving here till you bless me. You've kept me from running away. Now make this be good.
Really smart, you know, that helps me understand that.
And so whenever God is finally trying to get away, he basically punches him in the inner thigh and dislocates his hip and says, because you are wrestling with me. Israel means the one in whom God is wrestling, or the one who wrestles with God. It actually means both. And so if we read this for what it says, Jacob has God wrestle with him before he ever wrestles with God. Do you get that picture?
Yeah.
Now that, so I want us to tell the story the way it's actually written. We tend to tell the story as if this man comes up and Jacob wrestles him. No, Jacob's pinned to the ground all night and he's trying to get away. And whenever daybreak finally comes, he's like, fine, if I'm not going to get away, then I'm not letting you leave either. You're going to be in this with me. Can anybody hear the sermon in that? How often does God wrestle with us and we're just like, God, would you stop it? Would you just let me do what I want to do? And then finally, once we give in to God, it's only then that we experience the blessing, right? Now, the other interesting thing is we see this hobbling of Jacob feels a little bit like a punishment, doesn't it? Fine, you're not going to let me go. Bam. Okay, you're going to let me go now because he's going to be in pain. Anybody wrenched a muscle in your thigh? It's hard to just even want to walk, let alone for you to pop it out of socket. I've never had my hip replaced, but I talked to a lady who did, and she said it was one of the early hip replacements and it kind of kept popping in and out of joint.
Mm.
And she'd talk about how difficult it was when it would pop out of joint. So I got a picture of what this might have been like. Now, see, the interesting thing, Jacob has all of these goats and sheep and herds, right? He's getting ready to encounter his brother. With all of this herds and flocks, Jacob now looks like he's very powerful, doesn't he?
He sends them all ahead.
He sends them all ahead. When Esau finally sees his brother, what is Jacob like?
You got
And
that.
down.
Limping.
He's limping, he's hobbled, and he bows down to his brother. If Esau was angry at Jacob before, and he sees all of what God has blessed him with, when he finally encounters his brother, who is humbled, who's bowing down, and who's a crippled, do you think he's like, well, I can't kick the crippled kid now? You kind of get this picture. In essence, there's a sense in which God's crippling of Jacob doesn't just humble Jacob, but it actually
Humbles Esau.
it humbles Esau, absolutely. And it creates a situation where Esau, who for all intents and purposes should have the right to take his brother out, right? I mean, that's what Jacob's afraid of the night before. That's why he sends all his wives away. It almost gets the picture where I don't think this is going to end well. And after I had the confrontation with my father-in-law, I can't go back there. And now I don't know if I can go over here. Maybe I just need to slink away in the middle of the night and we can start all over, right? And the humbling of Jacob humbles Esau, and it allows for reconciliation. Has anybody ever experienced a time where something bad happened to you? And as bad as it was, that bad event actually allowed for reconciliation with others?
You have
It's amazing how God will allow us to go through things so that we are in the right frame of mind to be where he needs us to be. It's not that God causes. In this instance, God does cause it, right? God literally knocks his leg out of socket. But it kept him from running. It made him have to. He's not running away at this point once he's hobbling. And he doesn't have a horse or a camel or a donkey. He's already sent them on the other side of the river. His only choice is to face his problem because he's not going to outrun it. And I love this story for that fact that sometimes God allows us pain in our lives so that we will face the bigger problem that's to come.
Mhm.
We don't like it. We don't have to like it. But we should always be asking the question, while I don't like this, Lord, what can I learn from it? Any other thoughts about that story? I've almost forgot. We've got just a couple of minutes. I want to go back just a little bit. The story of Jacob and Laban in chapter 31. Anybody remember in the 80s and 90s, there was this big deal about the Mizpah coins? There was a coin that was broken in half, and you gave one to somebody you loved, and you kept one. And it says, as we are apart from each other, may we think fond thoughts or something along those lines.
You
You read the story.
Old.
Mizpah doesn't mean, let's think fond thoughts about each other as we're separated. Mizpah literally means you stay on your side, I'll stay on my side, and let's not ever see each other again. I always found it interesting how sometimes people will take a single verse, they'll pull it out of context and, oh, this sounds so cute. Let's do this. What verse is that's 31 verse
49.
49. We'll go back 48 and 49. Laban said, this heap is a witness between you and me today. Therefore, he named it Gilead and Mizpah. For he said, the Lord watch between you and me when we are out of one another's sight. If you oppress my daughters, or if you take wives beside my daughters, although no one is with us, see, God is a witness between you and me. Don't you dare disrespect my kids. You don't cross this line in thoughts of war, and I won't cross this line in thoughts of war. Mizpah. That's not quite the same thing as you give a half of your heart to your lover, is it?
No.
Anybody have someone in mind that they'd like to give a Mizpah coin to?
Mm.
By the same token, I want to acknowledge a fact here that even in God's economy, sometimes there are people that we need to draw such a firm boundary with that they stay on the other side of the line, and we no longer have a relationship with them outside of that boundary. Laban and Jacob's relationship is so toxic that even though he's his father-in-law, and the way Laban says it, right? These are my daughters. Those are my grandkids. These are my flocks.
You must treat my daughters if you take any wives.
We need to understand that God, even in God's way of thinking, sometimes the most righteous thing we can do is say, you're over there, you're not a part of my life, stay over there, I'll stay over here, and let's just love each other from a distance. Yes, sir.
Might not be commentary on that verses said it's addiction for partying, and in fact, it was a curse.
It was almost a curse, yes. You don't want the relationship to be so bad that the only thing left is declare Mizpah on it. This might, I guess this is probably, instead of giving it to the one you love, it should be the breakup coin. Right?
Or I do anyway.
Well, we are past our hour and a half, but I hope you're seeing how if we read these as stories and we ask questions of them and we be curious about them, and Tara's kind of even teaching us that, right? If you read her daily thing, when we're curious about what's going on, we can start to move past the cultural differences, the time difference, and the space difference. And this leans into the fact that we firmly believe that we have the Holy Spirit, right? And what does Jesus say about the Holy Spirit? He will lead you into all truth. If we ask God and seek God and we ask questions of his word, he wants us to know his truth. But we're also not meant to do it on our own. It's meant to be the body of Christ together. And so I appreciate that you guys have been here. And I hope this has been beneficial for you guys, and we'll keep this going. I will tell you that it's my plan, probably after Easter, I may actually also offer an in-depth Bible study where we will go paragraph by paragraph, verse by verse, and we'll break it down more in depth. So if that's something that you're interested in, let me know, because that's something I really enjoy doing. So with that, let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you and I praise you for this reminder that we don't have to have our lives together for you to want us, to seek to bless us, and to move through us. So Lord, may we just embrace you. May we be willing to wrestle with you as you wrestle with us. And Lord, may we live into that call that you gave to Abraham to be a blessing to all we meet. We do this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all very much. I hope to see you
Thank
guys
you.
Sunday. And
Bye-bye.
if you've got questions, don't hesitate to ask.